Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us here at 4:30. Former President Trump in Green Bay tonight. Vice President Harris will be in Madison tonight. And today, the MU Law School releasing its final poll of state voters before Election Day. And no surprise, it is close. Harris with a 1-point lead among likely voters. That's down 4 points from 4 points a month ago. But when you factor in the third-party candidates, including RFK Jr., Harris leads by 2 points. How about the Senate race? Tammy Baldwin, remember, a 7-point lead a month ago. It's now down to 2 points over Republican challenger Eric Hovde. As we always do, let's dive into the poll with the numbers with the poll director. And that means, of course, we welcome in Dr. Charles Franklin, the MU Law School poll director. So this is close. It has been close. Every poll says it's close. History says it's going to be close here in the state, right? So I'm curious, what kind of things could all of a sudden change that we see a much larger margin when this is all said and done than what the polls are suggesting?
Yeah, so it's basically a 1-point presidential race, but with about 5% that say they're undecided and as much as 9% that say they're thinking about a third-party candidate. So if something tipped that 5% undecided or that 9% third party, then you could see a shift. In 2016, we saw that in the exit polls, people who made up their minds in the last week went overwhelmingly for Trump, over 60% for Trump. But in 2020, those late deciders broke for Biden by almost as much. So late deciders are really hard to predict, both because of the events that may occur in these last 6 days, but also that these are folks who haven't made up their mind because they're conflicted in some way.
Those are the undecideds. What about independents? What is the data showing here as we get close?
Well, independents are leaning a little bit towards Harris at this point, a little less than they were a month ago, but still a majority. Earlier in the year, they had been leaning towards Trump. And so there has been a little shift with those independents. And so I think a question for independents is, do we see the turnout that otherwise we might expect, or are they in fact a little bit disengaged more so than the partisans this year?
Does history tell us anything about where that may wind up when it comes to independents here in the state?
I don't think so, except to the extent that independents usually end up breaking for the winner. That's not because they're clairvoyant or have a crystal ball.
They're not Door County?
They're not Door County. They simply respond to the atmosphere, the pressures of the campaign. And the problem we're seeing in this poll is that on the economy and Biden's performance and on the most important issues, Trump has a little bit of an advantage. But on personal characteristics, Harris has an advantage. So how do voters resolve this decision between a personality and whether it's the right personality for the presidency, or issues and whether that overwhelms doubts about personality?
Let's turn our attention to the Senate race. It's much closer than it was in your polling a month ago, now down to 2 points, which is what the internal polling has showed for both candidates. But anything in the data to suggest whether we might see split ticket voting? We've heard a lot of discussion about, can Tammy Baldwin outperform the top of the ticket to make it for a third term?
Yeah, I think earlier in the year when Baldwin had a larger lead, it was reasonable to talk about split ticket voting. Back in April, there was about an 8% crossover to Baldwin from the presidential to the Senate race. But that's down to only about 3% now. A lot of that is partisans coming home to their party. Some of that's happening in the presidential race where partisans are very strongly aligned to their presidential candidates. But in the Senate race, it also reflects Eric Hovde becoming known to Republicans in a way that he was not familiar to them in the spring, but now is pretty familiar. And so he scooped up most of the Republican vote, as most Republican candidates would. But back in the spring, he not being so well known, that opened the door to more crossover votes.
All right, I thought it was curious. You did ask folks about their preference for voting this time. And we know that the early in-person and the absentee voting numbers are very high here in the state. But it was really interesting what your research showed. And I'm curious what you think that means for people as they watch the results start to come in on election night.
There's a vast difference between people using absentee by mail who are going 70% for Harris, 30% for Trump, versus those who are doing in-person early voting, going 52 for Trump, 47 for Harris. And then election day, 56 for Trump, 44 for Harris. So I think the clear implication of this is that as we see the count of the votes coming in on Tuesday night, those early counts, which are election day primarily, with some absentees included, are likely to be more positive than the final result for Trump. And then as the absentee by mail gets counted late in the evening, we should see the expected rise of the Democratic vote. The real question is, where do we end up at the end? And in such a close race, it could easily tip either way. But people should absolutely expect to see the absentee ballots come in as quite heavily Democratic.
Speaking of in person, how will you watch this unfold? Your work is finished, my friend.
Yes, I have to talk about it for another 6 days, but I will tell you, on Tuesday night, I am having a beer and popcorn, and I'm just going to watch the returns come in.
No more trying to project for you for some of the major outlets as you've done in the past. We appreciate all the time you've spent with us leading up to this election, Dr. Franklin. Thanks so much.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.